We have a great panel coming up here, and it's my great pleasure to introduce two moderators that we have today: Amanda Hayward from Connecticut Innovations, and Dormer Stephen from Shipman and Goodwin. Both Connecticut Innovations and Shipman and Goodwin are integral parts of our ecosystem here, involved in lots and lots of companies that we spin out of Yale and here in Connecticut. And so we're thrilled to have them leading a discussion about biotech startup ecosystems with a great group of investors. Thank you all for coming, and we're looking forward to your conversation.
Thanks, Bill. As Bill said, my name is Dormer Stephen. I'm a partner at Shipman and Goodwin. I'm the co-chair of our business and finance practice group. I'm also the head of our life science practice. As somebody whose livelihood is inextricably tied to a vibrant and sustainable startup ecosystem, I'm very interested to hear our esteemed panelists' thoughts on how we build and sustain one here in Connecticut. As Bill said, I'm moderating this panel with Amanda Hayward from Connecticut Innovations. We'll have the panelists do a short introduction, and then we'll kick it off with some questions. Amanda.
Hi. Well, thank you so much to Bill and to the OCR and to everyone for being here. I'm excited to be part of this group. So I am a managing director at Connecticut Innovations. I just recently joined at the beginning of March, so making investments in early startups here in Connecticut. My background is originally technical. I actually ended up in Connecticut because I postdoced at Yale. And then I moved onto the business side, and I worked for about 15 years in an organization that specialized in putting new startup companies together, going out and getting those financed and kind of getting them launched. And then I moved onto the ventures side. I went to Cambridge and joined Baxalta Ventures, and then came back from there after the Shire acquisition to join Connecticut Innovations. So I've also been involved in the Connecticut biotech startup ecosystem for about 20 years, and also thrilled to be joining this group of panelists.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maud Tessier. I'm Executive Director of Business Development and Licensing at Merck. I'm part of our fully functional business development unit with search and evaluation and transactions under one roof that's located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which one could arguably say is the #1 biotech cluster in the world right now. Things might change, but for now we are. And I'm the lead for oncology partnering within our team. So our team as a whole is responsible for driving early stage strategic partnering for New England and also for parts of Canada. And I'm from Canada originally. I have a PhD in cancer biology from the University of Toronto. And shortly after, then my career transitioned to business development. So spent about 10 years on the sell side, both in biotech and in academia. I worked at Boston Children's Hospital for about 5 years. And joined Merck about 4 years ago when this new business development group was formed. So glad to be here, and thanks for the invite.
I'm Amy Shulman, and I'm a partner at Polaris and at a Polaris Innovation Fund. And looking around today, I think New Haven and Yale and Connecticut are going to give Boston and New York a run for their money. I think we've seen some really exciting things here. I'm not a scientist. I'm actually a lawyer by training from Yale Law School, and spent some time at Pfizer as the general counsel, running a few businesses there, selling a few, and then joining the Boston biotech scene 4 or 5 years ago. And what I find so interesting is, as a native New Yorker, I spend a lot of my life trying to understand, with Carlos helping me and others, how does New York compete with Boston? In what ways does it and doesn't it thrive? And so have thought a lot about biotech startup ecosystems, and really happy to be here today and to talk about some of the challenges and lessons, and excited to see the vibrancy at Yale. It's wonderful to be part of, so thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carlo Rizzuto. I'm a partner with Versant based in New York City. We are a West Coast early stage focused biotech VC. But about 3 years ago, came up with the crazy idea that there might be really good science outside of Boston on the East Coast. And so we established our office in New York, wanted to move on to the East Coast. We went to New York rather than go to Boston because we thought we could take advantage of what we thought were overlooked opportunities. Met some fantastic people along the way, like Amy and Tim here, which had the same idea before us. So it's been a very productive 3 years in that we've started probably now 6 companies based on science outside of Boston on the East Coast, and I hope to do many more.
Hi, I'm Tim Shannon. I'm a partner at Cohen Partners. So Cohen Partners is a venture firm that's raised about $5 billion. We're on our 11th fund and the 31st year of the firm. So it has a long and strong track record. I'm in our Connecticut office down in Westport. We also have offices in Manhattan, and then one in San Francisco and one in Menlo Park. And again, we do, in our firm, do both tech and healthcare investing. I certainly just do healthcare investing. And again, we predominantly focus on seed and Series A, a little bit of Series B companies. Prior to Cohen, I was at Curagen with a number of people I see in the room as I look at it, and of course Jonathan, who spoke early in the morning as the head of R&D and then the CEO. And before that, I was with Bayer, again, starting down the street here on what is now Yale's West Campus, where I became basically their chief medical officer, responsible for everything they did in humans from phase 1 through the support of the products in the marketplace. And I'm a physician by training, started my medical career on the faculty here at Yale a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. I'm Fred Cohen at Vita Ventures, which, unlike Canaan, is, I think we're still measured in months. We're about 5 or 6 months old. And I'm a physician scientist by training, and I suspect I'm sitting here because I was an undergraduate at Yale.
Great. So thank you, everybody. We've certainly got a really great experience sat on the panel. So there's clearly a lot of interest here at Yale and certainly at Connecticut Innovations. When we think about what Connecticut, New York, and other burgeoning startup ecosystems have both have in common and in contrast with the big boys like Boston and San Francisco. And so I think I'd like to start out by asking our panelists their views on what Connecticut, New York, and some of these other emerging ecosystems have that can be viewed as advantages versus the big boys. So what are our secret weapons that allow us to be successful? Fred?
So I guess I'm doing penance for having done time in New Haven. So as I think about why companies have worked in places like Boston and San Francisco, I always try to think about the intellectual capital and the human capital, the access to real capital, because you need the money to make things work. And I think that the universities in the Boston area and in the Bay Area were real places for innovation. And obviously Yale has that innovation. What San Francisco had, 30 years ago, was it was a really desirable place for people to move from or move to. Same thing, Cambridge is a wonderful place to live. That's been a little trickier for a place like New Haven, but a lot of innovation at Yale. And then the question is, the human capital. Well, there's obviously human capital on campus. There's a pharma industry, but it's been difficult to get people to stay. And so, one of the challenges that the area faces is how do you retain people when they see opportunities to move to Boston, which is pretty close by. But cost of living works to your advantage here. And then one of the things that I think people don't think as much about, but which the founders of Alexion found really valuable, was you were a short train ride from New York, which is major center for capital. And so I think you have to accentuate what you have, which is great innovation on campus, wonderful science, especially in the life sciences. I don't know the tech side as well. You're close by to capital. And then the question is, what are the things you can do to retain the human capital? And I think you've got the ingredients for success. It's unfortunate what's been happening to Alexion, because I think that hurts. But as you have more and more successful startups, I think if you look in the Bay Area, it's the children of Genentech and the children of Gilead and the grandchildren of Chiron and so on that start the next generation of companies. And so it's a 30-year arc, but I think it's one that can work here.
Yeah, I just would add to that. I think that the notion of this as an ecosystem and as kind of an intergenerational, however you define generational or family, is really important, because part of what happens when you take academics who, after all, are either on the road to tenure or are tenured, and put them in a startup is you have this kind of very natural insecurity of what if this one doesn't work? What if despite all our efforts this isn't right? And part of an ecosystem is that it catches you when you fail, and it recognizes that there are other opportunities. So having a one-shot company doesn't work for people who you're really asking to make a lifetime commitment to being a biotech entrepreneur or serial entrepreneur, and have that kind of muscle memory of what it takes to raise capital, what it takes to build a team in a company that's small, which is very different than running an academic lab. Who do you call on for building a board of advisors? So I think part of what universities and groups like ours can do a better job of in burgeoning ecosystems is to actually help create the conditions, not just for one success, but for multiple successes and for failures, which may be more inhibiting than we realize. I also just want to commend the role of university out-licensing departments, because the ease of working with a university's out-licensing department can make a profound, the lawyer on the panel is nodding, can make a profound difference in a willingness of VC to invest and to understand that there is a ready shorthand, and while not exactly a template, that kind of the university understands what it takes. So I think that is a major advantage that, you know, Yale can offer in terms of facility of building new companies as well.
And building on that too, being the big pharma representative on this panel, you know, there's always a lot of changes in big pharma companies. Sites come and go. I mentioned I'm Canadian, so I grew up in Montreal. Merck used to have a site in Montreal, which was a very productive site, the Merck Frost site. And, you know, I was there recently back for, you know, what is for the first time for me, business reasons, about a month or so ago, and was kind of really impressed by the fact that, you know, outside of what could have seen maybe as a failure a little bit, right, of closing the pharma site of Merck, now all these very qualified drug developers with track record of success, you know, they've all moved on to now being able to support and foster what is really a vibrant biotech scene now, kind of around where the Merck site used to be, which is obviously also close to McGill and some of the really strong institutions that they have over there at in the Montreal area, right? So I think the importance of having an alumni network, whether it's, you know, alumni from Yale, like there's many here, but also alumni from, you know, the big pharma companies that are or were within a certain area, could really help to, I think, catalyze a lot of the great biotech companies of the future.
So just building on what Amy mentioned, I mean, I think one of the advantages we do have is, you know, in addition to the intellectual capital, both at Yale and outside of Yale, in greater New Haven and even outside of New Haven in Connecticut in general. I mean, I think Yale does a terrific job of not only being very practical and getting the technology out into a commercial environment, but I think they also do a wonderful job of getting an entrepreneur or a wannabe entrepreneur academic transitioning from the lab to a commercial context. What are the other critical elements that an ecosystem needs in order to transition from a great idea from academia to a commercial context?
It's one thing I can comment on, because I've seen every flavor of this with different universities, is that many universities will prohibit academic founders from collaborating with the company that they've started. And this is a big barrier in our view to, you know, kind of fruitfully starting companies, because there's just a lot of synergy that can be gained by not reinventing everything in the company and leaving some things in the academic lab and, you know, taking things back and forth. And I believe that Yale actually allows that, which is a phenomenal step forward from my perspective. There are a number of universities that still don't allow that. So I think that's a key piece, and you know, I give credit to Yale for enabling that. So I'll just stop there, because I actually want to hear from Tim, because Tim's actually built companies here, and has probably more to say about this than anybody.
Try not to say too much. I think, again, in terms of the environment here, I'm obviously personally a fan of it, having, grown up about 5 miles away from here. So I've found it as a wonderful place to live, and I have lived around the world. But I think that Yale is the center of the ecosystem here, but that's a pretty good center. It's got to be on the top 5 of anyone's list of universities in the world. So that's a pretty good asset to have in your midst. And I think a little bit of maybe why the area in Yale's been a little bit slow, because it is, frankly, although it's in the Northeast, it is a little bit isolated between New York and Cambridge, and it's never had sort of that next door neighbor competitor, which is like intense, in Boston and Cambridge. I mean, there's really that rivalry going on that pushes people, and the Bay, it really is a factor, and Yale's been a little bit oddly of an island here, but I think that whole dynamic's changed, and the university's been great in trying to get companies up and going, and certainly open arms, with respect to investors like us, in terms of trying to get us in early, help shape opportunities, help direct early monies into opportunities to move them farther along. So I think that's the starting point here. There's a great pool of talent here. Now this is New Haven, population of whatever it is. It's not New York, it's not San Francisco. So I think New Haven has to be realistic about scale, but there's tons of talent from a lot of people sitting in this audience from the collective past of pharma here and biotechnology here. So I think there's certainly plenty of talent, and I think again the other thing that we have done in Yale has really helped is bring more investors down into the circle here. Really trying to consciously get investors from outside the region in here on a regular basis, because it really is those relationships. That's why things start locally. This is a business of relationships and knowing one another and getting comfortable with one another. We don't do anything cold, but those relationships and that trust, take a while to develop. So again, I think there's been a lot of progress in that regard in terms of expanding, the universe of investors who are getting more and more comfortable in this area. I think it's a great place to start companies, but as a professional investor, which I sometimes have to remind myself that I am, realistically, I can't do everything here and succeed, right? Because the scale really isn't here, right? So I certainly don't pretend that this can meet every investor's need, nor do I think Cambridge or Boston can, or the Bay. So I think the area just has to be realistic. In the expectations what it can be, but I think it is a very vibrant place. It's a great college town, and it really, to me, should be known as a college town with a really strong innovation system built up around it.
Thanks. So we talked a little bit about kind of some of the advantages that can be had here in an ecosystem like this, and obviously Yale and the other academic institutions here in Connecticut are great drivers of the technology, which is one critically important piece of making a successful community, biotech community. But I wonder if the panelists would comment on what we can learn from the more prominent sort of centers of biotech concentration like Boston and San Francisco. Are there things that we can look to bring from understanding the experience of investing there and kind of bring those learnings to Connecticut and New York and other places to help us be successful? So are there particular things that we can kind of learn from Boston, et cetera?
Well, I thought Amy made a great point about the effective safety net. One of the things that we frequently tell entrepreneurs in the Bay Area is, if this company fails, don't worry. Mm-hmm. You'll be on to the next one and the next one. And in fact, that's the expectation. Having started a company myself a couple of years ago and sold it after 2 years, so I was out of a job. That's just fine. And I think that in Boston and in the Bay Area, the idea that you have only been at one company for 2 or 3 years and it didn't work out, but you moved on to the next one, people look at that as you probably learned some useful things. In some communities, the fact that you, quote unquote, lost your job is looked at in a less pleasant way. And so that willingness to embrace risk, I think, is an essential learning from places like the community in Boston and San Francisco. And what I try and tell companies to do is do the killer experiment as soon as you can, right? We just want to know the answer. By the way, the most valuable asset in the company is not the dollars that I've invested, it's your time and the people. So figure it out. And what you sometimes see in markets that have yet to reach that level of maturity is almost a lack of willingness to do the killer experiments because you're afraid of killing the company. And in fact, what you need is to embrace it, to run headlong at it. I have listened to people talk to me about de-risk drug discovery. What I have learned is what that means is they didn't actually understand where the risks lay, right? That maybe you were taking no mechanistic risk, but you were taking commercial risk or IP risk or something like that. This is a risky business. It has digital outcomes to it, right? Things work or they don't work. You create value or you don't create value. That's the industry we've chosen to be in. Let's run hard at it. And let's use, our drive and our intellect to bias ourselves towards success, but recognize that not everything will work.
Yeah. Just to build on that point, I think apart from the most hardcore of entrepreneurs or maybe crazy entrepreneurs, most people who would be very happy joining a biotech company in Boston probably would be less happy joining a biotech company in Iowa, right? Not because of location per se, but because of this safety net issue. And I think one of the actual real advantages that New Haven has, it's between New York and Boston. So to some extent, you can kind of rent to own talent, right? In other words, people can commute in the early days and get to that de-risking point, and then maybe make the full commitment or continue to commute or get an apartment or whatever it is. And I think that's actually a real advantage that New Haven has because of its location, is you can draw people out of both markets to come here and do the critical experiment and then either evaporate or do the next company or stay with the company.
You're really creating an image of a safety net, evaporate, where to buy, I'm getting anxious just listening. But I think the relationship piece of it is just critical to this safety net. And here, to be very personal, when I left Pfizer and Big Pharma, I moved for the very first time, other than law school and college, out of New York. And I did that, at a stage in my life when most people don't necessarily pick up and move. And the welcoming kind of easiness, the genuine community was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life. And I think the porousness of that community, so when you ask kind of what can we learn, I think the point that Tim made about no competitor or no compadre right in the market actually may be a very profound statement. Because it isn't just the energy that MIT and Harvard get from competing with each other, or that Rockefeller and NYU and Columbia get. It is actually kind of what it means to have a larger sense of community. So building on what you said, maybe one way to do it is to say, we don't have to kind of be parochial about it. And we can see ourselves as part of a larger ecosystem and not keep on slicing it so much. And not be so kind of self-conscious about what does it look like here in this particular world, but figure out how do we join that, because there is so much here that would be welcome. I mean, the hardest thing for us is actually finding talent and ideas at a reasonable price point.
Right.
And the hardest thing about that is there are people who, when they've done it 10 times, think that automatically means that the kind of value inflection starts at a lot harder place than many of us who are doing early stage investing feel comfortable. That's just less true. in a place that has a newer track record, which makes it a phenomenally attractive market, I think, and a very natural part of, at this point, where do I see myself? I mean, I see myself partly in Boston, partly in New York, partly in China, so I think we see ourselves very much as part of a larger world.
Yeah, and I think to Amy's point too about maybe kind of broadening the community, right? I mean, I was in an event recently and folks were talking about how Cambridge is so crowded, right? And how the rent is so expensive. And so even for like a small biotech company that's trying to get off the ground, you don't want to spend a huge chunk of your seed funding or your Series A in rent because you feel like you have to be in Kendall Square. And so I think at one point too, like the model of Cambridge is great, but it has its downsides. And I think some small companies are probably getting to the point where they feel like it's not going to be sustainable for them, to stay in Cambridge in a way that's going to be meaningful for their growth as a company, right? And so I think there's some of that, downside, I think, to Cambridge. It could be explored in a meaningful way here in the Connecticut area. Because, you are very close, right? So I'm based there. I just took the train here. It was really easy. And, there's great science and great people here, too. So definitely, I think this closeness is something that could be really profitable.
So one of the things I think we have going for us is the state, I think, recently has stepped up in a meaningful way and provided capital through Connecticut Innovations and really empowered Connecticut Innovations to not only provide capital but to be a conduit to make connections for academics who are looking to make this into a commercial enterprise by matching them up with a business person to get this off the ground. They've funded the Bioscience Innovation Fund in Connecticut. We have the Angel Tax Credit. We have the R&D Tax Credit. So there's a lot of things that the state government has done to really, foster the environment here. Are there other things that you have seen the state government do or local governments do to help facilitate an ecosystem, and whether it's New York or in Massachusetts?
Well, I was actually having this discussion with a small group of people with the governor of North Carolina 2 weeks ago, because they want to do exactly the same thing, right? It's like, how do we bring more to the Research Triangle area, where there's already a lot in some ways, but more of a services industry than really a creation industry around biotechnology. And his staff was talking about ideas, credits and dollars that could be matching funds and so on. But, as we talked about it, we thought that was actually less valuable. We thought that the most valuable thing you could do were things to attract human capital. And, as you may know, the state of North Carolina has adopted some policies and then changed them a little bit and maybe readopted them, who can keep track these days, which don't necessarily appeal to the types of talent that tends to drive the biotech industry. Now, I think New Haven is more friendly that way, but as you think about what you invest in, I would turn the emphasis to human capital and the retention of human capital. Because once you've got the ideas are more portable, but the people are what make these companies succeed. The capital also, you can find capital, right? I mean, venture investors like to think that what they do is so valuable because they supply capital. But in fact, the capital that they supply is not the most valuable thing that they do, right? It's the people and the experience in, I use the metaphor of stepping on rakes, because a lot of building a biotech company is about avoiding the rakes that are out there. And, and I know that because I've stepped on plenty of rakes, and, and I know what that feels like. And a lot of what you're trying to do is build a network of people who have observed the various rakes that you can step on and can help you avoid them. You're not going to avoid them all, but that's where the human capital ends up being really important. So the things that you can do to retain human capital as a state are probably the most important thing. One of the things that Boston and the Bay Area do particularly well, when people go to those various universities to be graduate students or postdocs or residents or fellows, they often end up staying. Whether they stay at those institutions or not, they end up saying, I kind of like being in this area. And it's the retention of that human capital that I think is underappreciated, but which I find extraordinarily valuable.
Yeah, so I just following that, part of it does get back to the safety net. So I think when we try to recruit people in, that's the number one factor underlying decisions. If this doesn't work, is there someplace else for me to go? So as risk-taking as people are, they really aren't. They're pretty sensible when it comes down to decisions like that. So I do think here, continuing any investments that can help build out a bit of a broader network of companies would be useful. But in addition to that, making sure they're nice places to live in the city and outside of the city, right? Because a lot of these people young people.
They have choices.
Right. And efforts in that regard. It's a favorite one here, but an easier way to get in and out of New Haven. It's fine if you're in Boston or New York, but if you're not, it's a real pain in the neck. So, trying to get West Coast or foreign investors to come up here is hard because it's, there's not an easy way to get in.
Well, North Carolina specifically subsidized flights
Right.
in and out of RTP from various locations because what they learned is people didn't like transiting through Atlanta, right? Which, by the way, I hope they didn't have to commission a big study for that. But, getting to New Haven is not easy, right? I flew to Newark and I took the train. By the way, the train was late. I'm sure that happens on occasion, right? And so, you think about it, it added a lot of extra time to the journey. And I'm a guy who gets on a fair number of planes. Yeah. Making things work for people is a big deal.
Yeah, I really echo that. We've looked at a few of these things. So for example, like in New Jersey, you can sell your losses, right, to companies that have made profits, and you can sell your losses, and therefore you get a benefit for that. In Texas, they have huge amounts of money available for companies that are willing to relocate there. And I'm not sure that any of those types of programs really are compelling to us. Because the talent issue is the issue. And in New York City, right, they've invested a lot in infrastructure, and I think that was a different kind of a case because New York is a little bit unique in that you just physically do not have wet lab space, and so the city pretty much had to make it happen. Otherwise, it just it wouldn't be there because people would build condos and office buildings. But I think that the talent piece, and just to pick up on this train example, like it took 2 hours for me to get here on the train, which is just crazy, right? Why does it take 2 hours to get here on a train from New York? Like if it was an hour, it would be yet another level of convenience and ease for people to get up here. So I think solving those kinds of issues is really, really important.
I love this. We're going to solve the infrastructure problem in the United States. So, the more manageable other things like that are the kind of trailing spouse partner issue and childcare and young people who like to bike to work. These are all things one of our companies couldn't afford to stay in Cambridge, so we moved to Watertown. But key to our employees were that we had a bike subsidy, that we were near the bike path, that there was childcare for the young parents, male and female, who wanted to have proximate childcare, that there are places to eat and to go out and have a cup of coffee, and that it's not just like a kind of wasteland around these kind of artificial hubs. And so those quality of life things, even if I can't yet get the United States to build high-speed infrastructure rail systems, which would be fabulous for lots of reasons, not just New Haven, those are things that a state like Connecticut can do that really make a difference, because these are often two-career families. These are, ways in which harder to get your partner or your spouse to move to New Haven if she or he doesn't have options for jobs there the way she or he might in Boston or San Francisco or in New York. So making that work matters.
Yeah, and that fits with the human capital.
Yeah.
As you're talking about the infrastructure problem, I'm reminded of a time when I was visiting Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, and I was with a group of people from TPG, including our team from Beijing, and the tour guide launches into this explanation about how long the church has been under construction and so on, and the fact that it's going to take another 30 years for them to finish. And one of the women from Beijing said, "We finish in 2 years." So, you know, if you've got the will to do infrastructure, right? You know, you can make things happen. And, you know, we keep hearing a lot about infrastructure. We don't actually seem to be having much happen. We won't launch into that now. But these issues of quality of life do matter. But, you know, for example, if you could fly nonstop to Hartford from San Francisco, that would change a lot, right? That would make it much easier to get to New Haven. Hartford's a 45-minute ride or an hour's ride. You fly into New York, it's 2 hours to get up here, depending upon the traffic. And so what would it cost you to get, you know, some carrier to fly into Hartford periodically? Right? That's what North Carolina decided was worth subsidizing. By the way, they also subsidized a flight to London because there were enough pharma execs and other execs, and they just sort of said, look, it doesn't, you know, think about what you're spending on Connecticut Innovation, but having people decide that getting to Europe is easy is a big deal because this is a global business. So, you know, as you think about things from the government side, even without trying to do high-speed rail, which I'll give you is going to be a tough one around here. But subsidizing a flight in and out of Hartford, maybe not quite so hard.
We're going to go straight to the Hyperloop.
But another potential area of focus for a statewide initiative, at least in my view, would be the education of the next generation, right? I always find like we spend a lot of time having, again, some experience on the academic side. We spend a lot of time with the principal investigators, not as much with the graduate students or the postdocs. And me, from my own personal experience as a graduate student, you know, a decade or so ago back in Canada, right, there was very little awareness raised around biotechs and pharma and how do you develop drugs, how do you commercialize your inventions and turn them into products that can actually benefit patients in the future. And I sit on the board of the Oncopole in Quebec, which is a private-public partnership that Merck is involved in as well, that's really meant to foster cancer research and cancer care in the province. And there are, you know, a significant portion of that effort that's really meant to mentor the next generation, educate them, offer classes, internships, you know, rotations for graduate students to come to a company for a while and see how that's like. So all of these types of efforts, I think, to the comment about building talent is pretty important, right, to make sure that there's a continuity, right, between the people who are currently in the industry and are really learning a lot about what success looks like and what failure is like, and making sure that there is sort of a pipeline of talent really as our industry continues to evolve and grow.
I mean, one of the most fun things, you know, we've done in that regard is the Cohen and Yale Fellowship Program, where I did this with Colleen. We started about 3 years ago. It was Colleen's idea to tap into the next generation. And it's a program we target for the MD and PhD students, where we select 8 students a year and they come in and help us with diligence scientifically. My science is a little bit dated. And we in turn teach them about you know, company creation, venture capital, and industry. And the hunger at Yale is phenomenal. I think the first year we did this, we had like 400 applications or something. And the talent is, some of them are in the room, I better be careful, exquisite. I mean, these are really, really talented young people. And now, just a little plug for the other part of my life, we're starting one at UConn with the same thing. Again, so I just should mention, in part of the ecosystem, you know, UConn is probably in the top 3 public universities on the East Coast for sure, in a very heavy, you know, private university and college area. And again, that, you know, they're certainly interested in trying to be, you know, part of an ecosystem here, which, you know, hopefully should help. But again, though, you know, to your point, there is real hunger. And if you're at Yale as an undergrad and you don't see it around you locally, you say, well, I must need to go back to San Francisco to do that. Or I must need to go to Cambridge. So little things like that, I think, really help.
So maybe building a little bit on what Maud and Tim have said. I mean, obviously there are a lot of students, entrepreneurs, and academic investigators in the audience today. What advice would you guys have for would-be entrepreneurs and academics who want to translate their technologies as to things that they can do to make them more attractive for investment and putting a startup company together?
I mean, I would say just a few things. Be incredibly passionate about what you do and don't try and pretend to be something that you're not. And so we don't expect you to have facility with all of the kind of financing and everything else. We follow you because you follow the science. And so I think dressing yourself up as something other than what you are usually doesn't work. Know about the IP. And be fearless and protective of the science that you're generating, and follow it not because you want to be an entrepreneur, but because you have an idea of something that's going to be transformative for the world, and that you can't sit on any longer because it's going to drive you crazy if it doesn't get out of your lab and into the hands of people in whose lives it can make a difference medically and scientifically. And I think that's what draws us in, rather than kind of figuring out some artificial, kind of 18-month or 24-month inflection point that never, kind of works. And then, selling us on, how you're going to make us money, because I don't think any of us are here doing this for that reason. And so, and I don't know that any of us have figured out anyway that, the germ of what you have, how that translates in any linear fashion to something that people like to call an inflection point or a value. So don't, I wouldn't worry too much about that. And I think that is, what all of us respond to.
What I would tell people is one of the toughest things about being an entrepreneur is you have to keep two opposing thoughts in your head at the same time. You have to both be fearless and devoted to your idea, and at the same time you have to try and listen to the comments that are made and try and figure out what aspects of them can be helpful to you. And that's a really hard thing to do. And so as you're feeling that, just think about that you're being asked to hold two opposing thoughts in your head. Second thing I would say is, no matter what you think, it's going to take longer and cost more. It just turns out to be true. And to Amy's point, as best I can judge, if companies are successful, in general, everybody does okay. And if companies fail, nobody does well. And so focus on, can I succeed? Or if I'm going to fail, figure it out as quickly as you can and move on to the next thing. Because the idea may be good, but the time may not be right, or the tools may not exist to execute on that idea today, but they may exist in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. The ideas around CAR T therapy, they were around for 20 years, but only recently got picked up again and made to work. I can't tell you how many times I saw gene therapy companies in the early 90s, which all went splat against the wall, and now it's working. Okay, monoclonal antibodies went through a period of they'll do everything, they'll do nothing, they do a bunch of good things, right? And so that's the nature of this industry. So even if you have an idea that doesn't work, sometimes it's the time or the coexisting technologies that get in the way rather than that there's something wrong with the idea.
I would say three things. One is solve a very specific problem. So for example, don't solve like patients are resistant to PD-1. Solve that in with PD-1 treatment, you see downregulation of class 1 as one escape mechanism. NK cells should kill those cells. I'm going to solve why aren't NK cells killing those cells, right? That's a specific problem. Second thing I would say is find someone who's done it before and attach yourself to them and suck everything that you can out of their head. And then the third thing is don't be greedy. Recognize that you're going to need to bring in a lot of people to help you. You're going to have to bring in more money than you think you're going to need. But if you're successful, you're going to do really, really well.
Yeah, so I call that the buddy system. I guess more formal word is, mentee system. But I think if you haven't done this before, you need to find some people to help you. And again, it gets back to the relationship part of this. Particularly for the faculty and maybe the students who are here, I can guarantee you're smart enough to do it, based on what you already know how to do. But it's, again, just getting familiar with the business aspects of this and what can make things work and what won't make it work, what will make it interesting to someone and what won't make it interesting to someone. And that doesn't happen overnight. It takes iterations of running your ideas past someone, getting some feedback, modifying, what you're planning. And again, some of it's the environment. The environment might not be right this year, but 2 years from now it may be right. So again, it doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with, relationships with a community of people who are involved in creating startups, either, from the company perspective or investor perspective or both. So if you're interested in, engaging in that part of, your opportunity as an inventor, or as an entrepreneur, you just have to get yourself embedded in that system and around people who you can help bounce your ideas off of, and eventually you'll get there.
Yeah, and I think one thing about academic entrepreneurs is they are so lopsidedly, and I say this, I may be the only person here without a scientific or a medical background, so I stand in awe of that. But there is a kind of lopsided brilliance that sometimes doesn't make for the best listening. And what I have learned from my fantasy that life in academia as opposed to life in corporate America was that it was collaborative and the life of the mind and the world of ideas. And having gone to Yale Law School, of course, that was completely the case since we didn't have grades. I learned is not necessarily the way kind of academic labs and funding work. And so you are building a company and you are listening and trying to get advice. And so one of the things is really try and actually do that, because the temperament and the skill set is really quite different. And it is important to practice those other skills if you want to get funding and be successful in this world. And then the other thing I say as the mother of 3 20-somethings is they're a little bit allergic to the idea of kind of like, I don't want, networking and like talking to people before they need something because they don't want to bother them. And I think to the idea that this is a relationship as opposed to a transactional. I mean, it's funny for a bunch of venture capitalists to be sitting here talking about relationships as opposed to transactions, but it really is a relationship business. We all have known each other before. We all work together. We all share ideas and trade and syndicate deals. And so you want to get to know us not when you only are asking us to fund a particular thing, but in general. And so I know that sometimes there's a hesitancy about doing that, but it is really an important piece of how to thrive in this world.
Yeah, that was going to be my first one as well. It's never too early to start building your network of potential investors, potential partners, whether it's Merck or another pharma company, getting to know people who you then may align yourself with when it's time to form your new company. That's definitely my number one advice always, even for graduate students, for instance, right, who are trying to figure out sort of what else they can do with a PhD in the event that they don't want to follow in their supervisor's footsteps, right? That's also a great way of just getting to know the variety of people out there and the kind of jobs that with a scientific background you could have, that it's not within the walls of a lab per se. And then my second advice, right, from a partnering perspective is also to not oversell at any point. That's also something that we see quite often, right? And as scientists, I think it's great to always rely on the data first, right? And try to make as compelling of an argument as you can based on the data that you have about how you feel the technology or the asset you have is going to be transformational in terms of how patients are being treated or diagnosed, or depending on your technology type, right? Because especially if you come into a meeting with these fine people here, or myself and our scientist colleagues within Merck, they will really assess sort of the data that you're presenting, right, and your vision for what it could become. And there's kind of a fine line between what it could become and then overselling it right to the point that, sometimes we meet with folks who claim that, their drug is going to cure every single cancer patient out there. And then it comes off, frankly, as sometimes a little bit unrealistic. And then it makes the group lose credibility in terms of, can we see ourselves working with these individuals? And so, making sure you don't oversell and that, you really, I think, articulate the competitive advantage of your technology going forward is pretty important too.
So can we open it up to the audience for questions? Does anyone have any questions for the panelists?
Harry?
So much better with the lights.
I know.
Is this on? Barry Schweitzer, Elm Street Ventures. This is actually more of a comment or a plea to some of the comments that were made about transportation in Connecticut. Just want to let folks know that there's 12 hours left in the state's legislative session, and there's a bill before the legislature for extension of the Tweed runways, which is very critical for allowing more flights to go in and out of Tweed. So go out and get your coffee and contact your state senator if you're a Connecticut resident and ask them to bring that bill to a vote. But I'll also ask a question. Another comment is that currently incubator space in Connecticut is essentially full. And I was wondering what the panel thought about the role of incubators in the ecosystem, and do they feel that that's a critical part, or something that just comes along for the ride?
I could start on that. We're sort of living through a blossoming of incubators in New York right now. I think they definitely have a role to play. It's fantastic if you can get a company started, very, very quickly in pre-built space. You can't beat that. New York is fortunate in that, recently J Labs decided to open up there. Cambridge Biolabs came and opened up a site as well. And then we have the Alexandria Center. So I think that's really been transformative for the city. It's enabled, I was saying earlier that when I moved to New York 3 years ago, there were literally 0 venture-backed biotech companies. I think we're about up to 12 now, so in 3 years. So that's quite a good start. And now, if I see something that I like, I know that I have a place to go where I can get a company started quickly. So I think it is a really important part of the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would second that. The real estate market in the Bay Area is incredibly tight. And so if you fund a company and they can't really start doing experiments for 9 to 12 months because they can't get space that they could use, that's just money wasting. And so the ability to get into an incubator with 2 to 4 to 6 benches and get going on experiments while you're simultaneously looking for space really accelerates the creation of value in these companies, or tells you that it's time to move on to something else, which, again, as we keep reminding you, is an okay result. One of the things that I would tell you is that, having looked at the business model of incubators, it's a good idea to be in the incubator business. Because you're basically renting out benches at prices that would make the Four Seasons blush. When you're looking for, minus 20 space or minus 70 space, yeah, that's more expensive than Massa's. And yet, if you're a small company, the marginal cost relative to renting space, the most important expenditures are on people. And so even though these on a per square foot basis are, usurious, as part of the ecosystem and the availability of things, the ability to have a fax machine that you can use for 2 hours that's right there, that's really valuable to you. So I think that they serve a great role. The incubator space in the Bay Area is basically always full, and people are building more incubators in large part because it works, and in large part because the market is constrained. In a market like This one, it may be easier to find space, and so incubators may not be as important. In places like Boston and San Francisco, they seem to be essential right now. Probably New York too.
Yeah, hi. My name is Kevin Rocco. I'm the CEO of BioRes, located here in New Haven. We're developing an implant for ACL reconstruction. I wanted to follow on to what the first gentleman said about New Haven's airport, Tweed. I travel a lot. We do preclinical testing in Australia. We did clinical testing in the Netherlands. And even though it's only a 2 full-time person company, travel is constant and time is finite. And I was squirming in my chair a little bit when you're talking about infrastructure because no one mentioned the fact that New Haven has an airport. And I do fly in and out of it regularly. And so yes, there is a bill up and the airport is trying to expand, but the other half of that is if you build it, they won't necessarily come. So I think there's an obligation on all of us to actually use the airport. And so I would encourage everybody here to try flying out of Tweed. I landed there from San Francisco on Monday through Philly, 45-minute layover in Philly, and I'd argue it was faster than going to New York and hauling it up. So just a little public services announcement. Please fly Tweed.
I've made that connection.
Hi, this is a really great conversation. Thank you all for being here. I'm Dawn Hosevar with BioCT, and my question is, we're doing a lot of course discussion about startup ecosystems, and then as we all know, in Connecticut, we've had some great anchor pharma companies and just some flux with that. But I think in order to have a really great ecosystem, it's the mid-level, the growth stage, when startups are ready to grow and get into another space. I think we have there's something missing here, and I'm just wondering from your experiences in other ecosystems, any advice on how we create the step-up graduation platforms for companies to stay and thrive here. Thank you.
I mean, I think probably attracting mid-level companies, maybe even, you know, either I was going to say harder or no more magical than any of the other things. They all seem to, I think, require the same sorts of things in terms of talent, infrastructure, the ability to move freely between companies. And I think having the biggest fear of a state, I think, is that their fledgling companies will grow and leave. And I think that's what you really want to spend time and energy making sure that those that you nurture and you've put state investment dollars in and you've created that talent pool feel anchored to this state enough to stay. And that's really, I think, where the focus should be. I think we're out of time.
Hi there. My question is about the role of networking events and convenings in the bio startup ecosystem and how you get the right cocktail of both the appearance and the reality of what people get out of events and convenings.
So I've been volunteering for Mass Bio for a number of years. I'm the co-chair of their Business Development and Finance Working Group. So we organize a lot of events within the Boston, Cambridge area, and I'm sure similar things could be done here if they're not already happening, right? And I think for us, it's been finding kind of the right balance of networking, but also having some sort of like panel discussion around a specific topic that might be timely for whatever reason, right? Whether it's talking about a specific area of science or whether it's talking about a specific topic within the finance realm, like tax reform or obviously investments from China as an example, which is one that we'll probably be doing soon. And so, you know, I think that's a good place to start, right? And most of the Mass Bio membership are very small companies, right? They have, for instance, a purchasing consortium, which helps small companies, you know, buy things in bulk along with all other members, right? As one example. So there's a lot of different ways of supporting small biotech companies, but that tends to be most of the membership there. And so that's a good way of, you know, meeting people who are going through the same thing as you are. If you're a small biotech company and have some challenges, it helps you to connect with folks who've gone through it before, people like me from Big Pharma who may be, a partner or collaborator in the near term, investors, right? And so I think having the right blend of people within that networking helps. But I think having the panel discussion around a topic of interest tends to help kind of have a good mixture of people from all these various sectors kind of come together.
Yeah, and I think if you're not a member of BioCT, formerly known as CURE, that's a great networking event. They do great programming. They're terrific opportunities to network not only with academics and entrepreneurs, but also capital sources are there frequently. So I would encourage anybody who's not a member of that to check it out. It's well worth your time.
One thing I would add is that, and I've seen this in New York, is there's different events for different target audiences, right? And one thing that I found is that in New York, they would be sort of these all-comer type events, which are great because you expose a lot of people to biotech in New York, and that was a new thing, and so it has a purpose. But a lot of the people that I would like to meet there didn't come, and talk about other investors. And one of the reasons they didn't come is because they knew if they came, they were going to get bombarded with all sorts of like fly-by-night companies that were going to send them lots of follow-up emails, and they have to deal with all of that, right? And they have to give out business cards, and so people weren't coming to the event because it wasn't meeting their need. And so what I found in New York is that having different groups with different purposes is actually a good thing, and so to know who your audience is and then solve for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Another example, we have BioBreak in Boston that's organized by the Locust Walk Partners Consulting Group. And I think, do they have one in New York now? Anyway, they started in Philly, they have one in Boston. I think they've been trying to start one in California as well. And that one is more of a networking kind of at the C level, right, or partner level. So it's a little bit more of a senior networking event that's a little bit more focused. But depending on what your goals are and who you want to meet, there's certainly a variety of events, but that's a good place to start if you're new to the community and want to really grow your network quickly to go to some of these BioCT events.
I think with that, we should probably wrap up because we have a break. Let's thank Norma and Amanda for organizing this. Thank you, Maude, Amy, Carlo, Fred, Tim. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today and sharing. We really want to continue these conversations. We have a nice little break for you, but we need to be all back here at 3 o'clock. The tech and the biotech groups come back together for 2 keynotes and awards. So get some coffee, enjoy the fresh air, do a little networking, come back here in about 15 minutes.